So one of the important things to think about when establishing a demonstration plot or an experiment in any new area is what was the history of that area, what was planted there before, what treatments have been applied if we're talking about experimental station, or what chemicals, what herbicides, and what any residual effect that may have intrinsic in that area that's going to affect your treatments.
So yeah, that's very important, the history, knowing the history of the area, as Dr. Wallau said, because we have to make sure that, that the area is, again, homogeneous if we're going to apply an experiment, or if you're going to implement or impose an experiment in a certain area. For example, here we used to have alfalfa before the cowpeas. And in what we can see is that we have a really good weed control, at least within the experiment. But if we had moved the experiment a little bit further here, closer to the alleyways, we can see that we have an expansion of weeds, primarily broadleaf weeds. So if we had the cowpeas in this area and we have a really high weed pressure, our chances of using a herbicide, for example, would have been reduced, because we have a majority of broadleaf weeds and we have a cowpea as a major crop. So I think that is one of the major ideas before planting an experiment, is knowing very well what was the history of your land before planting the new crop.
Yeah, so investigating the history of the land before we plant this new experiment, it's very important to learn what was planted before, what are the herbicides and fertilizer applications before that could influence your treatments. If the crop, and if there was a treatment before, if the crop is a legume and one crop is a legume and the other crop is a grass, it's likely that where the legume was, there is going to be more nitrogen in that soil. So if you come across with a new treatment and you don't account for that, there will be differences given the soil characteristics, not because of the treatment per se. Many times we see some fields that have been herbicided with herbicides that have residual effect, and those residual effects can last for a long time, even across seasons, even more than a year, and you come back later on and try to put an experiment and things don't grow. That's because there is still herbicide in that soil that's going to affect the growth of your new crop.
What are the ways that we can overcome some of the history of that land? First, at the rec centers, and particularly here at the Plant Science Research and Education Unit, they keep really good records of crops and also fertilizer and pesticide applications. So communicating with the farm manager is the number one idea to know the history of those plots. And then if an area has been receiving treatments for a long time, for example, our Bermuda grass fertility trial, then one of the management practices that we can do is we can plant a perennial crop, for example, Bahia grass, in that area and leave it grow for many years. So in that case, we can reduce the effect of the nitrogen and then use that land again for future experiments.
So when we think about on-farm experiments or demonstration trials, we need to be very careful also with what the history of that field is. For example, if we were going to put a trial in a big pasture, we need to avoid locations where cattle gather, for example, close to water troughs or feeding sites or hay feeding sites, or there is history of feeding there. Any place close to a shade or to the gate, because it's more convenient just to put the experiment right off of the gate, but that is also where there is more disturbance. Many times we go to our producers and they say, oh, you can put the trial on that corner of the field, but also that corner is where there is less management applied, let's say less weed control, or is a load of dolomite was dumped and then the soil characteristics on that corner are totally different. Many times we see our experiments fail because of those little things that are intrinsic to the field and not related to the treatments were applied per se, and that is generates a very bad impression of us as researchers and extension agents, and also for the technique we're proposing, because the producers will perceive that as the technique is not appropriate or is not good, instead of there was a failure on the process, a failure on the trial, and so you end up burning, or for lack of a better word, burning.
Yeah, so choosing the experimental area or the area where you're going to be putting those trials, and particularly if they are demonstration plots where you're going to have farmers visiting you, or you're going to have a field day showcasing your treatments, is very important. So I would say this is a very important topic, and sometimes we tend to forget that, and we end up having, you know, very weak or poor experiments because of the lack of planning by selecting a good area. So another example could be planting your trials next to trees or next to an infrastructure that will create shade. So in those cases, that's when having a good experimental design can minimize the effect of the shade or the effect of the trees. So in those cases, again, my recommendation will be to have a randomized complete block design where you're going to start blocking going away from the shade or from the structure that is imposing that effect on your experiment.